The top 10 worst places to live in Alabama for 2025. This list is not based on my personal opinion. It is crime rankings overlapping homicide rates with recent overdose analytics to discover which cities in Alabama have the worst crime combination for 2025. Now, I can already tell that this list is going to make a lot of people in Alabama very angry because people in Alabama have the notion that the blackest cities are the worst, but when you overlap homicides, which are murders, with overdose death rates, you start to discover that some of the white cities in Alabama are actually faring way worse than the black cities that are always labeled as being the worst. We don't try to make the numbers match our narrative. We're letting the numbers speak for themselves. And this is going to be really difficult for the people of Alabama to like this because it isn't opinion based. It doesn't match the narrative that they're trying to get out there. These are real numbers. And again, this list, I didn't decide what these cities were going to be. The numbers told me what these cities were going to be. My opinion here is completely irrelevant. I'm telling you, overdoses and homicides combined, these are the worst cities in Alabama. We don't look at property crime because every city looks at that differently, but there's two types of numbers that simply cannot be faked. Overdoses leading to deaths, an impossible number to hide, but Alabama doesn't publish those numbers. But Alabama does publish the number per 100,000 or the rate per 100,000 at which people are overdosing by emergency response, not by overdose death rate. So these are not people that passed away from an overdose. These are people where EMS responded to the overdose. Before I throw the list at you of the top 10 worst cities to live in Alabama, let's first look at a few maps and a few numbers so you guys can start to get a picture of what goes behind making today's video and how we reach these results. Alabama has the third highest homicide rate in the country. Take a look at some of the cities that I've highlighted here. This is back from 2018, and while that is an old analytic, it is before the madness of COVID that changed everything for the United States, and it should give us a good general idea of how these cities have been historically. Notice on that list cities like Pritchard, Phoenix City, Birmingham, and Anniston listed among cities with the highest homicide rates. Now, on my channel, I usually don't care about violent crime analytics, but it is noteworthy that many years ago, Anniston had the highest in the entire country. You don't get there by mistake. These are Alabama's recent overdose incidents per thousand by rate. This is recent analytics. You can see that around the Birmingham area in the north central part of the state is where most of these incidents are happening. Now, there's some rural communities in Jasper, Alabama that have had rates as high as 82 people per every 1,000 have had a medical response to an overdose in the last year. That's absolutely insane. Imagine that. Here's a town where you grab 1,000 people, and out of those 1,000 people, 82 of them were treated for a medical response to an overdose. That should just give you an idea how bad things have got in some of north central Alabama's rural communities. Now, they also publish number of incidents per city, and what is crazy is that some of the smaller cities in Alabama had by number so many people with EMS overdose related incidents that despite being by population almost unheard of in Alabama, by number they're among the largest cities. Places like Coleman, Alabama, Gadsden, Alabama, and Jasper, Alabama, despite having relatively small populations, are right up there in number with cities like Mobile, Montgomery, and Birmingham. To give you an idea, Anniston, Alabama was literally on par with Montgomery, Alabama, despite the fact that Montgomery is a city with 200,000 people. Just to give you an idea, the small towns of Coleman and Jasper combined numerically had more people than Huntsville, Alabama. And for my regular subscribers, I usually talk about overdose deaths. These are overdose response incidents. It's a completely different metric, but it's the metric that the state of Alabama gives us to work with, so that's what we're using. But just as a metric, overdose death rates in Birmingham, the state's largest metropolitan area, are on par with Louisville and Philadelphia, easily among the top 6 worst in the country. So things in Alabama are not looking great. And then you step into the rural communities outside of Birmingham, and those rates are even higher. So we're talking about a situation where Alabama's largest metropolitan area is now among one of the most drug-ridden areas in the country. Number 1 is Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham has historically had the 3rd highest homicide rate in the country, but it's now a competitor for number 1 with 70 per 100,000. It is now one of the most dangerous cities in the country. Only New Orleans, Louisiana can compete. Cities like St. Louis and Detroit have improved recently, leaving Birmingham as a contender for the most dangerous city in the country. How dangerous is Birmingham, Alabama as of right now in 2025? Pay attention to these roadblocks here. That's not for road construction. That's to keep people from different neighborhoods from clashing with each other. Law enforcement has literally had to go in and put up barricades in some of Alabama's largest cities like Birmingham and Montgomery to keep people in different neighborhoods from going at each other. Overdose rates in Jefferson County, Alabama are now among the top 6 highest in the country, which means that when you're talking about overdoses in Alabama, Birmingham is as bad as Philadelphia or Louisville or any of the other cities that are dealing with an overdose crisis. Birmingham is now among those cities. I want to be clear that the number 1 spot also includes anything in Birmingham's urban core that the grid pattern runs concurrently with. Fairfield, Midfield, Bessemer, all these areas are part of the same highway hub, same street grid patterns. It makes no sense for me to include every last one of those spots. It's generally understood that those are practically part of Birmingham City and they're in the same Jefferson County. So we're not going to have 5 different cities on the top ranking. That's ridiculous. They're all within Jefferson County and Birmingham's the largest city. That makes Birmingham the number 1 spot, and that includes all of Birmingham's attached suburbs that are part of the same grid pattern of roads. If you were to move to Inslee or Bessemer or Midfield or any of these other suburbs right next to Birmingham, you kind of understand it's part of Birmingham, so it's ridiculous since they run concurrently in the same grid pattern to include a listing for every last one of those cities. On today's video, we're going to combine a few cities that are concurrent to each other because that just simply makes sense. And we don't want 2 cities to take up the entire top 10 list. Now, where is all this coming from? Analytically, it looks like it's coming from the north. That's a logical conclusion. After all the other epicenters like Nashville, Louisville, and Appalachia are to the north. Only New Orleans is to the south. And why isn't Jackson, Montgomery, and Mobile being flooded to the same degree if it was coming from the south? None of that makes sense. Many people think it's coming from Atlanta, but if that was the case, then cities like Montgomery and Auburn would have the same exact problem, and they don't. You don't see a spiraling out of Montgomery like you see out of Birmingham, so none of that makes sense. Every logical conclusion would aim that it's coming from the north, Memphis, Nashville, Louisville, or Appalachia. It doesn't seem like it's coming from the south and from the border like many people assume. Then you got all the burnt down houses that the locals claim are because of explosions in laboratories. And if that were truly the case on most of those burnt houses, then it wouldn't be an importation issue because importation is pure, and it seems that then you would be dealing with precursors, which would suggest Memphis or Louisville, which have large international airports. At the end of the day, we can't fix a problem if we don't really admit where it's coming from. But what is clear is that Birmingham is flooding the adjacent communities, particularly to the north, and this has led to this area of Alabama being an area you just don't want to live in, with Birmingham being the absolute worst. Number 2 is Jasper, Alabama, located in Walker County. The situation with overdose responses here is the highest in all of Alabama. It's on Interstate 20 right before you get to Birmingham, coming from Memphis, which would, of course, confirm the theory that it's coming from Memphis because of the large airport in precursor form versus what we're being told coming from the south from the border. Regardless, this county has the highest rate of emergency responses for overdoses in all of Alabama. And while its violence and homicides are relatively low, what's happening in its rural regions when it comes to emergency response to overdoses is insane. One particular rural community, the rate is 82 out of every 1,000 people, the highest in all of Alabama. That's roughly 1 in 10 people if you think about it. And I know the people of Jasper, Alabama are going to throw an absolute fit about this ranking. But keep in mind, I didn't make these numbers up. You guys did. On top of that, the town has a reputation for being a sundown town. I made a video in this town and I talked about that. And nobody in the town really seemed to deny the fact that it's a sundown town. This is one of those places in Alabama that has got to be among one of the worst places to live because of how backwards the people here are. And, of course, the fact that it's known as a sundown town, which means that they're not very welcoming to outsiders. I've done a lot of videos in Alabama. When I look through the comments of Jasper, it seems like these people are really full of hate. Definitely one of the worst places to live in Alabama, and they have the state's highest propensity to have overdoses. Birmingham has more by number, but by rate, it's higher here. For the whole county, the rate is 5.2 out of every 1,000 people. So for every 1,000 people, 5 of them had to have EMS come out for some type of overdose-related issue. That's wild. Now keep in mind, Birmingham, Alabama is predominantly African American, so it isn't a surprise that a rural community right outside of Birmingham that's known as a sundown town would get flooded with all types of harmful stuff. There's a lot of hate in the air in Alabama, and well, this could just be a manifestation of how much hate there is here and the types of things that result from that hate. That is my personal opinion, but the numbers collaborate either way. Number 3 is Cullman, Alabama, tied at number 3 in the state for the most overdose response incidents. The city doesn't have a violent reputation. Well, in general, it has extraordinarily low homicide rates, extraordinarily low crime rates. The problem here is that it's also a sundown town, and anybody black or Hispanic or any other race has a lot of trouble in this city, making it extraordinarily dangerous if you're not from here. So it's safe for them, but it isn't safe for you. Regardless, they have the 3rd highest propensity to overdose of anywhere in Alabama right now. Between January and March, 37 people had an EMS overdose related incident. That's crazy when you think how small Cullman, Alabama is. This area is literally in the middle of an addiction crisis. Just to the north of Birmingham, Alabama, it is that region that has the most overdoses in the state. Cullman has a reputation of being among the top 3 most racist cities in America, on par with Harrison, Arkansas, and Vidor, Texas. I know a lot of people who've worked in this city, and they tell me that it's absolutely terrifying. They get followed by motorcycle gangs, and they have a lot of threats, and they're forced to leave their job. It's just an absolutely terrifying place to live. On top of that, they also have a huge labor shortage. So companies here are constantly trying to bring people from other parts of the country to work in this city because the locals simply refuse to work, and they refuse to allow other people to come work in their city, which has led to a huge labor shortage in their area. So they kind of have this area in a chokehold. Now, logic would tell you if this county has the 3rd highest incident of overdoses, shouldn't they also have a lot of crime, trafficking, and arrests? They don't. Part of the issue with Alabama is that they seem to let the white population get away with whatever they want. It isn't so much what they do to other people, it's also what they're willing to let their own people get away with. If you have an onslaught of overdoses, you also have a lot of possession and trafficking and related criminal offenses that go right along with that. And if you don't, then law enforcement must be looking the other way. This is one of those incidents where the crime analytics have been manipulated to look like it's the safest place on earth to prove their racist agenda. But in reality, if you were doing things accordingly, well, then you wouldn't have all these overdoses. In other words, there's definitely some, misappropriation going on with the analytics coming out of Coleman, Alabama, that have made people believe that it's the safest place on earth. But in reality, how can the safest place on earth also have just high overdose rates? Doesn't make sense to me. And of course, it shouldn't make sense because it isn't logical. It's on this list. They may be considered to other people one of the safest cities in Alabama, but how can you be one of the safest cities when you have one of the highest overdose rates? Clearly, they're trying to cover something up very well, and it isn't going to slide with me. The city is also known as a hub for weapons trafficking, so that isn't exactly a great title. There's a lot of covert things happening in the background, so while things here may on the surface appear to be safe and great, there's all types of crazy stuff being covered up here, and it doesn't miss our radar. If you're known as one of the most racist cities in America and you have a lot of overdoses, you can't really sit here and pretend like your town's one of the best places to live. There's obviously some issues here that are trying to be covered up, but numbers don't lie. This area is the hub for addiction in Alabama, and some of the rural communities here are suffering greatly. Cultural reference to this area, there's a song called Shake That Bottle. It's low-key called the Alabama Anthem. It's a song about shaking a bottle, self-explanatory. It mentions Blount County, Alabama, which is just outside of Coleman. However, today the overdose rates in Coleman County far surpass Blount County, despite the fact that that county used to be known as the Shaking the Bottle capital of Alabama. Hilarious how they call this song the Anthem of Alabama when it's a song that talks about, making things in a laboratory. It's really sad how even cultural references have for a long time been pointing at this area as a place of crime. But one of those issues is, of course, that as long as it's white people committing the crimes, it's good to go in this region. Unfortunately, they can't cover up the overdoses as a result of the amount of consumption that the white population is using here. So again, you can only cover things up for so long. Law enforcement in many of these rural white communities, this is a problem that also happens in Maine, for example, where they have ridiculously high overdose death rates, but they claim to be one of the safest states. You can't be safe if your community is flooded with dangerous substances. It simply doesn't work. High overdose death rates, trafficking of substances and arms. What else do you need? The title, one of the most racist cities in America. How people think this is a safe place is beyond me. Number 4 is Gadsden, Alabama. Despite being a relatively small place by population, by number of incidents, they surpass the much larger city of Huntsville. Let's just give you an idea how bad the overdose situation is in this part of Alabama, and it shouldn't be a surprise because, once again, cultural references. You may know that Etowah County has been on the news for the TV shows about the whole prison thing going on here. It just gives you an idea, an insight into how bad things are in this county. You may also remember that back in 2018, the Etowah County Sheriff was at the heart of a scandal where he took the money that was meant to be to feed the inmates and used it to buy himself a beach home in Florida to the note of $750,000. That's how much money this guy was allowed to steal. And after all, it is Alabama, good old boy system that did nothing about it. They said it's legitimate. This guy can literally steal almost $1 million of money that was to feed the inmates. The inmates went hungry, but he bought himself a beach home in the Florida Gulf Coast. Overdose rates here are tied at the 3rd place for the highest in Alabama for reported incidents. While Gadsden's homicide rate isn't exactly the greatest on earth, it isn't as bad as the number 5 spot. The city's definitely more dangerous. But today on today's list, we're really going to put emphasis on overdoses because this is the new trend that is ravaging rural communities in Alabama. Now, Alabama for many years was below many other states' averages, but over the last year and a half, it's starting to be higher than Alabama's previous overdose death rates. Now it's higher than California and on par with Florida. So overdoses are starting to become a thing in Alabama, and thus it's important for us to pay attention to which particular counties are having the worst problem and consider that when we talk about crime in the state of Alabama, since after all, it is starting to be a considerable problem for the state. Wasn't the case 3 or 4 years ago, but now it's definitely starting to be a considerable crime concern. Alabama is starting to become one of the worst epicenters for overdoses. Thankfully, many regions like the Huntsville area, the southern part of the state, have below national average rates per county. Some of these counties don't even have any incident reports. That's great that not all of rural Alabama is suffering this problem, but the central part of the state is suffering. Gadsden isn't too far from Birmingham, and it's right in that corridor, the area that has the most activity in the state. So despite the fact Anniston is more dangerous than Gadsden, Gadsden is rated higher on our list because the overdose situation here is more vulnerable. The city's facing a lot of problems. It's kind of run down, poor, and impoverished, and if they don't figure out how to make things turn around quickly, they're probably going to have a massive population loss in the future. As the town continues to go to crap, things definitely do not look good in Gadsden. It has a bad reputation, and it's possibly going to get even worse, especially if their overdose rates continue to hover above most of Alabama. Number 5 is Anniston, Alabama. For those looking for a horrible place to live in Alabama, look no further than Anniston. It has the cheapest real estate prices of anywhere in the United States as of a few years ago, and most people recognize that a city this dangerous and crappy shouldn't be worth anything to begin with. The homicide rates in this city have just been absolutely unreal. At a time, it was even considered the most dangerous city in the United States. Anniston had nearly as many overdose incidents as Montgomery, despite the fact that Montgomery is a significantly larger city. When it comes to overdoses here, it's out of control. Its incident rate of overdoses is among the top 5 highest in Alabama. A lot of people here live in government housing. A lot of people here are just simply trying to leech off the system, not trying to be productive. Home prices here are among the lowest of anywhere in the United States, so even if you want to buy a house, it's practically free. You can literally buy houses here for less than $20,000 that are inhabitable. Despite the fact that they're practically giving houses away, you'll see a lot of vacant houses because who the crap wants to live in Anniston? And if the crime stats like the most dangerous city in the United States for violent crimes of any city its size weren't bad enough, it is said that the people here are among some of the nastiest you're going to meet anywhere. Just rude, disrespectful, argumentative, and violent. Who the crap would want to live here? Number 6 is Mobile, Pritchard. Basically the same city. While most cities in the United States are no longer segregated, Mobile is still one of those cities where you can find some distinct taste of segregation, and in the past, no, in the present. Mobile, Alabama is one of the larger cities in the States, but somehow it is just as backwards as any small town. On almost every trip to Mobile, we've noticed things like tires hanging off of trees, garbage bags hanging off of trees, and of course, throwing garbage at the segregation line, kind of marking where the white neighborhoods and the black neighborhoods start. Mobile, Alabama is still segregated, and the massive segregation lines that run through the city are all distinctly marked with tires, garbage bags, and of course litter, letting people know what the neighborhood boundaries are by race. Absolutely insane. The overdose rates here are the only county in southern Alabama that are significant. And while Mobile's overdose rates are better than many other cities along the Gulf Coast, it's still too high for being in the state of Alabama, particularly the southern region of the state. Now, Pritchard is basically wrapped around by Mobile city limits, and it's practically the same city. They made it its own city limits so that they wouldn't have to provide services to the black community there, which has left these people with garbage heaps throughout the entire city because there's no garbage collection. Alabama is so racist in towns like Mobile that you still have areas that don't have garbage collection or road service repairs because it's a black area. That's Alabama in 2025. Over the years, I've heard the people of Mobile cry and complain about all types of things on my videos, but I've never heard a single one of them say, dang, we've really done some horrible things here. They're completely content with the situation that they've created in segregating parts of their city and simply becoming an absolute segregation town in the year 2025, leaving black areas with no paved roads, no access to utilities, not even garbage collection. They're completely content with all that. Nobody in this town's complaining about that. This is basically how they design things to be, and well, they seem pretty content with that. Never ever seen somebody in Mobile, Alabama say, wow, guys, we've really done something wrong and let's try to make it better. No, I've never seen that comment in the comment section. All I've seen is them come up with excuses and reasons why things have to be the way they are. And since we're dealing with some insubordinate turds, I want to show you guys the city limits of Mobile, how they come up against Pritchard. You can clearly see that Pritchard is engulfed by the city of Mobile. So yeah, it's practically Mobile. Leave it to the state of Alabama to draw up city lines simply to disadvantage an African American community. Alabama 101 right there. I mean, to be clear, some parts of Pritchard don't even look like a city. They look like a landfill. It's a miracle it wasn't number one on today's list. It's just that Birmingham is so much bigger that the numbers override since Pritchard is geographically a small area, but Mobile as well. Let's look at some of these analytics, shall we? Pritchard's homicide rates are disappointing. It's always been higher than the state and the national average, with some years the rates hitting as high as 60 per 100,000. It's really just a sad story to tell. For those particular years, we're talking 6 times higher than Los Angeles. Now, it's really hard to get both homicide and overdose analytics for the state of Alabama because they try to cover up how bad things have got, but we get the idea that Mobile, Alabama isn't as bad as, let's say, Birmingham. And let's keep in mind that Mobile's homicide rate itself is never below the state or national average. It's always above national and state averages. So there's a lot of homicides here to begin with. People in Mobile, Alabama somehow think that their city is nothing like Montgomery or Birmingham, but the analytics don't agree with that. Number 7 is Montgomery. Now, while Montgomery does not have high overdose rates, the city is extraordinarily violent. Its homicide rate has reached levels as high as 43 per 100,000 over the last few years. It ranks lower than some of these cities because despite the fact that it is one of the most violent cities in Alabama, it just doesn't have enough overdoses. The people here are just too broke to be able to afford it. Now, I lived in the Montgomery metropolitan area, and it would be one of those things where people would be able to afford it when they got their food stamps and disability at the start of the month, like from the 1st to the 3rd. But beyond that, they couldn't afford to be messed up for the whole month because they're that poor and miserable. It's pretty sad that the reason why their overdoses aren't higher is because they just can't afford it. Over the last few years, there's been a bunch of homicides targeting Hispanics in the city of Montgomery. It seems that law enforcement in Alabama, particularly Montgomery and Birmingham as well, don't seem to investigate homicides if the victim is Hispanic, which has led to Hispanics in Montgomery being targeted for robberies consistently by African American gangs who are racially profiling Latinos. Now, when I lived in Montgomery, Alabama, this could have happened to me 3 or 4 times. I was always on point, and I always found a way to outpower the people, making them rethink whether they wanted to victimize me. But overall, it just isn't worth to continually live in a city where you're constantly being targeted simply for your race. Montgomery is racist, it's backwards, it's violent, and it's definitely one of the worst places to live in Alabama. Their homicide rate of 43 per 100,000 is nearly 2 times higher than Chicago, Illinois. Homicide here is a pastime for these people. But the good thing is, if you move to Montgomery, the locals will be glad to tell you what parts of the city are black and white, so you're never crossing the segregation line. It isn't defined and marked like it is in Mobile, Alabama, but if you get caught on the wrong side of town after dark in Montgomery, you are certainly going to be a victim. And if you do get victimized on the wrong side of town in the Montgomery metro area, law enforcement has the practice of victim blaming you and saying, well, you should have just known not to be on that side of town, so you're offsides on the defense. It's your fault. So if you go to Montgomery, Alabama, and you end up getting victimized, law enforcement is going to tell you, well, you shouldn't have been over there to begin with. You know the segregation line, why you cross it? So it turns you into the offender when you're the victim. That's the way law enforcement gets down in Montgomery. Definitely a very dangerous city. You have to stay alert in Montgomery. There's a lot of carjackers and a lot of victims of opportunity here. If they see you doing something, you're not alert, you're not paying attention, there's no chance you're not going to be victimized here. This city is always looking for somebody weak and defenseless that they can take advantage of. When it comes to racism, living in Montgomery is like living in the 1800s. And when it comes to safety, specifically at night, you got to be extremely careful. For example, as I'm riding down this road, I can see a group of 7 or 8 men crossing the road. That is my signal not to go down there. And while Montgomery isn't as dangerous as Birmingham, driving into the wrong neighborhood here can be just as deadly. Up ahead, you can see that there's a roadblock, and at night, they even put law enforcement. They've had to put up barricades in many neighborhoods on the west side of the city to keep people from different neighborhoods from going at each other, which means if you're driving through the city, you have to drive through a zigzag of roadblocks because law enforcement is concerned that if they open up the flow of traffic through neighborhood cities, it ends up being nothing more than a freaking slaughterhouse. Montgomery definitely is one of the worst places you can live in Alabama. Don't let the affordable real estate prices fool you. Living here is setting yourself up for an absolute nightmare. Crime analytics for this city are practically useless. Half the time, if not more, when you call the cops here, they simply are not going to take a police report. They're going to tell you that you're the problem and that they don't want to be bothered. The only analytics we can rely on are the homicide rates, 2 times higher than Chicago. Who the crap would want to live in a place like that? There's a lot of gangs in Montgomery. Now, the symbolism and all that is most people wouldn't know what to look for, but if you know what you're looking at, there's a lot of gangs here. The city is also notoriously known for being jealous and envious and hateful. The only famous person that's came out of here in recent history was Doe B, and they killed him allegedly over jealousy. So anybody trying to make a come up out of Montgomery gets drawn right back. They don't let you escape this trap. These people really are miserable. Number 8 is Greenville, Alabama, just south of Montgomery. This town sucks. There's years where their homicide rate is like 35 per 100,000. That's literally higher than Chicago. Now, the locals here are fairly segregated, and if you're passing by on Interstate 65 and walk into the wrong business by chance, they get dearly offended that you violated their segregation laws. These people are living like if it was still the 1800s. So here we go. A town that's falling apart, looks like crap, has extraordinarily high crime rates, extraordinarily high homicide rates, and still wants to live by the rules of segregation. Who the crap would want to live here? This is clearly one of the worst places to live in Alabama. I couldn't even think of a reason why you would want to move here. Number 9 is Selma, Alabama. Despite being relatively a large town with a lot of historical importance, this is absolutely one of the worst places you could move to in Alabama. It isn't on a major highway. It's actually kind of one of the few larger cities in an area that doesn't have access to highways, which means if you're in Selma, Alabama, you have to drive quite a bit just to get to another city. You don't want to get caught here at night. You know, many people say that many of the burnt down houses in Alabama are lab explosions, but I'm going to tell you why that isn't true, because Alabama's Selma simply doesn't have analytics for that. It never has. So we know that the reason these houses are burnt down is because people are literally being forced out of their homes and neighborhoods. It's an extraordinarily dangerous city. It has a very high homicide rate. Selma simply is the type of place that has no future. Despite the fact that real estate prices are extraordinarily low here, you would be dearly mistaken to think you should move to the city. Now, despite the fact that Selma was well over an hour from where I lived, I ended up working here quite a bit. There simply were no services for what I did anywhere in this region of Alabama, and people would pay me all kinds of crazy money to go to this area to work because they couldn't find anybody out here willing to labor. On top of that, they told me even if there was a service, they simply wouldn't trust somebody from Selma going on their properties, fear of theft. I remember I had one job where the lady was just getting rid of cardboard boxes from Christmas, and she told me she just didn't want anybody out here to know that she had bought stuff for Christmas. So she wanted somebody from out of area to pick up these boxes because she was just afraid of having somebody knowing she bought new stuff. That's how miserable this region of Alabama is. Income rates are horrible. I couldn't imagine why you would want to live in Selma. Despite the fact there's a lot of civil rights and importance in this city, it really doesn't seem like people remember the reason all these things happen. It's a fairly racist place, predominantly black city, and if you're not black, you will feel very out of place here. Interesting fact, this video was filmed before the new national parks rule. After those rules came into place, you can no longer record anything along this trail. I believe it's part of the national trail system now, so this footage was recorded before the law. Anybody recording this bridge crossing today will violate the national parks new rules on recording in areas that are nationally designated. Number 10 is Phoenix City, Alabama, located in the Columbus, Georgia metropolitan area. Historically, it's been a mob town. There isn't much here except for free government housing. It's run down, sketchy, and dangerous. The people here are also very hateful. It's another one of those places in Alabama that just simply sucks. This list couldn't be complete without Phoenix City. Just like many other cities on today's list, the real estate prices here are very affordable. I remember back in 2020, you could buy a brand new house here for less than $110,000. And even then, these houses simply wouldn't move. Phoenix City, like I said, is right on the border of two states that have different laws. Since the days of Prohibition, that has lent itself very well to all types of illegal activities. And to this day, Phoenix City continues to be somewhat of a trafficking point, being between two different states in one single metropolitan area. Despite having extraordinarily high crime rates, the people that live here seem to be completely unaware that their town is a crime-ridden crap hole. In my Phoenix City videos, the locals were even upset at me, saying, "How could you say our town is bad?" It seems like the people here are in complete denial of how bad things are in their city. And like I said, while the rates of overdoses are not high here, it is a transit point between two different states with different laws. And that makes this city kind of a constant issue with people moving back and forth. Last time I stayed out here, my hotel was right on the state line. And I walked outside in the evening and there was somebody on a bench. And they were just sending people back and forth across the state lines. Apparently in Alabama, the laws are stricter than Georgia, so they keep all the work on the Columbus side. And when people need something in Phoenix City, they move it into Phoenix City in small little batches because they're afraid of being caught by law enforcement. So there's constantly people moving back and forth all hours of the night with small batches. Because again, the laws in Alabama are stricter and law enforcement is stricter as well, which means that anybody needing something on the Phoenix side is going to get it delivered from Columbus. Total crime crap hole. Alright guys, before we finish today's video, I want to show you guys this graph. These are the homicide rates for Birmingham, Alabama, and they've skyrocketed recently. Back to 2018, Chicago and Los Angeles, much higher than both of those cities. A lot of times people in Alabama simply don't understand how dangerous their state is. They listen to all this Fox News radio and they think that Los Angeles and Chicago are far more dangerous, but they don't realize that analytically, Alabama is considerably more dangerous. You guys saw that Anniston, Alabama was on our list as well today. Let me show you guys, just so you guys can have a comparison how Anniston compares to larger cities. Anniston, Alabama, despite being a small town, has homicide rates higher than Los Angeles, higher than Chicago. There's years where it's even higher than Baltimore. 3 years where the analytics were just ridiculously high for homicide rates. So living in Anniston or Birmingham or any of these Alabama cities is actually more dangerous than living in Los Angeles or Chicago. But sadly, the people that live in these towns are completely unaware of how bad crime has got in Alabama. And they actually think that things in California or Chicago are worse because all they listen to is, well, of course, political radio that's been misleading them analytically. They have no idea how dangerous Alabama is. Now, I travel all over the country. I go to Chicago, Philly, Los Angeles, and I can tell you that nothing comes close to how dangerous Alabama is. I know that Louisiana cities have higher analytics for homicides, but I feel like when it comes to at random being victimized by somebody violently, no other state even comes close to Alabama. Not even Mississippi, not even Louisiana. It seems like when it comes to just randomly willingness to attack a complete stranger, Alabama takes the cake by far. Maybe Detroit, maybe St. Louis, but without a doubt, when it comes to scary and unpredictable people willing to hurt anybody at a moment's notice, there's nothing like good old Alabama for that. I mean, really, there's only a few other cities, like, for example, Jackson, Mississippi, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where if you're just stopping at a gas station at night, are as dangerous. These cities in Alabama really have a huge crime problem, and while there are rural communities and parts of Alabama that don't have these crazy crime analytics, take the city of Dothan, Alabama. Its crime analytics are not anywhere near these other large cities in the state. Huntsville, Alabama didn't come anywhere close to these cities as well, but you have parts of Alabama, particularly the central part of the state, where overdoses are starting to climb to national levels on par with Philly, Louisville, all those bad cities. Homicide rates, Birmingham used to be the third most dangerous city. Now it's competing for the first. So things are really bad in Alabama. If you're moving to the state of Alabama, these are definitely 10 places that you need to cross off your list. The state of Alabama is the third most dangerous state in the country by homicide rates. Only Louisiana and Mississippi are more dangerous on a state level. But keep in mind that I feel like in Louisiana and Mississippi, it's less likely to be directed at a complete stranger, when Alabama, these people here know no boundaries and morals. Racism in Alabama is probably by far worse than Mississippi and Louisiana as well, which means that if you're in cities like Montgomery, particularly Mobile, and you can't forget Birmingham, are cities where you also have to be aware of what the demographics are around you, because entering an area that is the wrong side of town for your race can be pretty freaking dangerous. It leaves you exposed to being victimized, and if you try to reach out to law enforcement, they're going to tell you you had no reason to be there, so they're not interested in taking your police report. This is the reality of crime in Alabama for the year 2025, and these were the top 10 worst places in the state to live in. If you're moving to a large area in Alabama, I would recommend Baldwin County or Huntsville, but the state as a whole has a lot of problems, and I think you should reconsider the state of Alabama. Despite being extraordinarily affordable, the crime and hate in this state makes living here absolutely miserable. It certainly isn't my cup of tea, but hey, violence and hate could be yours. In the past, when I've made videos like this about the state of Alabama, what resonates the most with me is that people in Alabama's third grade education, they don't even understand what a rate is. This is the type of thing they should have learned like in the second or third grade. But there's literally grown adults in Alabama who do not understand crime rates. They don't understand what a rate is. This is something they should have learned in elementary school. But again, the state has a really bad education system, and the people here are very ignorant and proud. So look through the comment section and laugh at some of the things these people are about to say. They're going to say that they live in these places and that I'm a liar and their cities are safe and they've lived here forever and they've never been murdered yet. You can look through these comments and you'll see the level of ignorance that some of these people have. Even though we're working with pure facts and analytics, they are unlettered and uneducated, and unconceivable to them the notion that where they live is one of the worst places to live in the country. Normally when I make a video like this, I don't have to put this much emphasis on information and analytics, but because the people of Alabama are so ignorant, I don't want you guys to look at the comment section and believe what you're about to read from these people. So I have to just kind of base everything on solid facts, so that if somebody that doesn't live in Alabama starts to scroll through the comments, they can at least see that I used real information to compile my video. Because if they were to read the comments and believe it, they would think I'm a complete imbecile based on the things people are about to say. That's why I base so much of today's video on nothing more than pure analytical information, because if I base it on anything other than that, You just can't have a conversation with these people without them trying to discredit you. And to somebody unassuming or unaware of how these people run, they may look at the comment section and think that I'm an actual complete idiot based on the comments and the things people are about to say. But that's why we base today's video on information.